In January 2000, a 10-year-old internet company absolutely shocked the core of the business world by swallowing a massive, traditional media empire whole. The price tag for this totally unprecedented move? A staggering $165 billion. That is exactly what America Online, AOL, paid to acquire Time Warner. It immediately became the largest merger in history, handing a scrappy tech upstart control over legendary legacy brands like CNN, HBO, Warner Bros., and Time magazine. This resulting valuation placed the combined entity at the absolute pinnacle of corporate power. We're talking a total worth of $226 billion. But, it was a soaring peak built on a surprisingly, almost shockingly fragile foundation.
Because within just 3 short years, the combined company lost $99 billion in value. Yeah, $99 billion. It transformed what everyone called the deal of the century into the most catastrophic corporate merger ever recorded.
Now, AOL obviously didn't start out as a giant. Back in 1985, it was just a tiny service called Quantum Computer Services, offering online content strictly for Commodore 64 users. By 1991, they rebranded to America Online. Fast forward to 1997, they hit 10 million subscribers, and by the year 2000, they were an absolute juggernaut with 30 million people logged on. So how did they grow so incredibly fast? Well, their strategy to make the internet easy for normal, everyday people was brutal, but honestly, it was brilliant. By the mid-1990s, they were flooding American mailboxes with 250 million free trial discs every single year.
To put the sheer physical scale of that guerrilla marketing campaign into perspective, at one point, AOL was literally consuming half the world's entire CD production capacity. Half. They forcefully made themselves the default gateway to the web. Those discs were everywhere. In cereal boxes, inside magazines. They were even taped to your pizza deliveries.
The crucial thing to understand here is that in an era way before Google or Facebook, AOL wasn't just an internet provider. They controlled the entire online experience through a totally closed ecosystem, a walled garden. Your dial-up connection, your email, your news, and those classic AM chat rooms, it all lived exclusively inside AOL's software. And man, it was incredibly lucrative. At their absolute peak, this walled garden generated over $5 billion in annual revenue. They had 30 million subscribers, happily paying $19.95 every single month just to log on and hear that famous "You've got mail" chime. Their dominance was total. Half of all internet traffic in America flowed straight through AOL servers. Just think about that. They had more subscribers than any major newspaper had readers. Their CEO, Steve Case, was being hailed globally as a visionary who democratized the web. But that begs a really massive question. If they were so unassailably dominant, what exactly did Steve Case know that the rest of the market totally missed? Well, he secretly realized that AOL's monumental success was built entirely on a temporary technological gap. The fatal strategic flaw was actually the technology itself. Dial-up was inherently slow, it was confusing, and it absolutely required a walled garden just to make it user-friendly. But Case knew broadband was coming. Cable and DSL were 10 times faster, and they offered completely open access to the web. He knew, for sure, that once people had fast, always-on connections, they'd abandon AOL's expensive handholding altogether, which reveals the real motivation behind this mega merger. Case's decision to buy Time Warner was actually a desperate, though highly rational, attempt to transform AOL from a deeply vulnerable access provider into a massive content company, right before the dial-up model inevitably collapsed. The strategy made perfect sense, but the execution? Absolutely disastrous. It was completely derailed by a toxic corporate culture clash. On one side, you had AOL, young, aggressive, metrics-driven tech guys. On the other, Time Warner, old media veterans who valued editorial independence and deep, long-term relationships. Integration meetings quickly devolved into toxic battlegrounds between two entirely incompatible groups that literally refused to respect one another. Then everything fell apart simultaneously. The dot-com bubble popped, and AOL's advertising revenue cratered overnight. At the exact same time, their subscriber base started declining, just like Case feared, as broadband adoption finally took off.
And to make matters worse, accounting scandals emerged, revealing AOL had actually been inflating their revenue through dubious ad deals. This triggered an SEC investigation and a wave of massive executive resignations.
Following this depressing trajectory down to the bottom really shows just how far they fell. From that historic merger in 2000, we jumped to 2003, when the suddenly toxic AOL name was dropped from the company entirely. By 2015, they were sold to Verizon for a tiny fraction of their peak value, and by 2021, the brands that literally defined the early internet were bundled up and sold off in a bargain bin private equity sale. The sheer human toll of this collapse was probably best captured by Ted Turner. He was Time Warner's largest individual shareholder, and he stated it pretty bluntly: it was the biggest mistake in corporate history. Just to ground that regret in hard numbers, $8 billion is the staggering amount Ted Turner personally lost, as that $165 billion acquisition was written down to effectively zero.
Yet, there is a fascinating and honestly somewhat surprising epilogue to all of this. As recently as 2021, 1.5 million people were still paying AOL for internet access. Most of these were elderly users who simply didn't realize they no longer needed a dial-up subscription to get online.
It leaves us with the ultimate cautionary takeaway in tech history. Being first doesn't mean being permanent. AOL confused a temporary technological advantage, basically making a confusing early internet accessible, for a permanent industry moat. And that was their fatal error. They brought 30 million people online, but once the internet grew up, it didn't need training wheels anymore.